Today, I'm speaking with Professor Lorraine Besser, a philosopher and professor of philosophy at Middlebury College. She's the author of The Art of the Interesting, What We Miss in Our Pursuit of the Good Life and How to Cultivate It. Lorraine, thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Yash. I'm looking forward to speaking with you.
Why are people not able to live truly good lives?
I think the biggest problem is that we really don't know what we're looking for. We get so many different messages from both our ancient philosophers, from society. And, I think it can make it really hard for us to be able to figure out what is going to work best for us. And along the way, throughout all of these messages, there's been one really important aspect of the good life that's been left out. And that's the notion of interestingness and how much value that can really add to one's life.
Yeah, so let's get into that. Could you talk about what the main components of a good life would be and how we can go about bringing those into our own lives?
Yeah, absolutely. So the familiar ones, familiar parts of the good life, right? We need happiness, right? Happiness is such an important aspect of the good life, and we all know why, right? It feels good, it's pleasant, it's enjoyable, uh, and so a really important part of the good life. Also, though, not all good times are going to be happy times, right? And so a good life is going to be multifaceted. It's not going to have any just one note, even if that's like a happiness note. So I, I, I identify three different parts of the good life. Happiness is one of them for sure. Another one of them is some form of meaning or purpose within our lives, right? Really important. We have these minds. They're really great at pursuing things. We can accomplish things. So meaning, purpose, that kind of thing, really important to the good life. But I also argue that there's a third component to the good life, and this is tied to the notion of psychological richness. So psychological richness describes the kinds of experiences that we can have, which really challenge us. They introduce complexity to us, and they stimulate the mind to have a range of different thoughts and emotions that really can leave us with a change in perspective. And psychological richness, it contributes interestingness to our lives. It makes our lives more interesting, and I think that's a crucial third component of the good life. So we've got this package of the good life then with these three different aspects to it, and of course the question is like, well, how do we have it all, right? And how do we combine those into one's own individual good life? And what one thing I think is really important to think about when we're thinking about a good life is the fact that a good life doesn't, it happens over time, right? It's not all about one moment or set of moments. And I think if we think about the good life as happening over time and in stages, then, we can really realize that there's time to have, a multifaceted good life, that we can aspire to live a life full of meaning while reserving moments for happiness, and also while seeking out moments of psychological richness. And so I think that we can, as we think about our own good lives, we can really strive to find areas in our life where we can experience all three things. Probably not at the same time, although there's sometimes it can happen, but probably not all the same time. And so we just really, I think, I talk a lot in the book about really trying to pay attention to where your mind is at in the moment and where you are at in the moment, and trying to figure out what is good for you in that moment. And so I think that by really getting in touch with ourselves, by knowing a lot about what we're kind of after, what's involved in these three different dimensions, that we can piece together a really good lives for each of us. And they won't all look identical, all right? No one's identical. We find happiness, meaning, and interestingness in different things. And so it's an individual, it's an individual aspiration, but one that we can really take hold of by learning about it, and by recognizing what's really important out there.
So we'll dive pretty deep into how to bring interesting into your life. But I want to track through the other two components first a little bit more. It's pretty intuitive to want to prioritize happiness. It feels like it's just the most natural thing that you'd want more and more of. What's wrong with making that the number one priority in your life? Why does that not work?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. This is one of those societal messages I feel, certainly currently we get told a lot, right? Happiness is the most important thing we can go for. Um, and my concern with a life devoted to happiness, really stems from how happiness arises within our minds and what happens to it. And if we look to the science underlying happiness, there's a couple of things that stand out. Uh, the first is that happiness and here we're talking about happiness as it's really largely determined by pleasant, positive, affective feelings. And one thing we know about those feelings is that they just don't stick around, right? We can't continually be in a state of pleasure, and our systems are just not designed to do that. So we will inevitably adapt to whatever kind of experiences of positive affect we have to level us out. There's all sorts of evolutionary reasons for this, right? Pleasure originally for us functions as a reward for doing things that are good for our survival. And so the way that we are wired is certainly not to be sustained sorry, the way that we're wired is not a way that's going to really be conducive towards sustained happiness.
Hmm.
And so that's one of the reasons I think we just need to recognize that our experiences of happiness will be limited, they'll be short-lived, and also to be okay with that, right? Sometimes I feel like we feel so bad and we're doing everything right, and we're still just not feeling happy all the time. And that it's not our fault, right? And it's just what's going to happen. And one thing though, another thing that I worry a lot about with the pursuit of happiness is that happiness is really difficult to pursue. Sure, we can learn about the different scientific correlations and then go out and try to seek, relationships and whatever it is that the science is telling us. We can do all of the right things, but it's not necessarily going to be the case that we're always going to feel happy thereby. And so I think that when we set our eyes all on happiness, right, when we're like, all right, happiness is the good life, it's the most important thing for it. What happens when we do that is that we're setting up these expectations for ourselves that we'll be able to get to this place that we can't, right? We can't sustain lasting feelings of happiness. And that but we continually will want to focus on it and pursue it as if it's something that we can really target and approximate to by our own plans. I think we're much better off seeing happiness as what it is. It's a great, awesome experience of positive feelings, and we can certainly do things that'll set ourselves up more to have them. But we when we have them, we should just take them as they come and then let them leave as they go. And I think if we reconfigure our relationship to happiness, not only will we be happier, right? But we'll also recognize that happiness is something that it comes in moments and it's short-lived
Right.
and that's okay because there's a lot of other things we can do to fill out our good lives.
Yeah, and even just knowing that it's not supposed to be there all the time itself is somewhat relieving, right? In that you're not always constantly expecting it, or in the moments when you don't have it, it doesn't feel like, the worst thing in the world then. But what people say next is, okay, let's maybe happiness is not going to be there all the time, but what you should strive for then is meaning. That feels philosophically deeper. It feels just more right that seems to be, the last thing that we need to, finish the puzzle here. Why does that still come up short to you?
Yeah, thank you. So, um, there's a couple of reasons. So first, one thing just to point out is that it's certainly true that when we strive to find meaning within our lives, right, it certainly seems like something more that we can control, right? So we can choose, to devote ourselves towards this project that we'll find meaningful, and um, so it seems a lot more within our control, but we know one thing that's the psychological research tells us though is that there's this arrival fallacy, right? And the arrival fallacy describes the experience, which is common, that you will that what sorry it describes the common experience of feeling very left out and feeling very flat after achieving something that we think will
Mm,
really give meaning to our lives. When we focus on achieving something with the expectation that we will feel some kind of fulfillment at the end of the day, what we find is that rarely does it deliver, right? So when we can think that, writing a book, having it recognized, getting tenure, finding a new job, we'll think these things will somehow deliver some kind of experiences of fulfillment, but often they just really don't. And it's a common thing that happens. So here again, it's when we're focusing too much on meaning or finding meaning in our lives, there is a way in which we can put all of our eggs in this kind of basket and expect
mm,
it will come and deliver, right? And it often does not. Uh, there's a second kind of more deeper reason why I worry about again focusing one's life exclusively on meaning, and this has to do with the fact that uh, meaning really, lives that are meaningful or lives that are in search of purpose or achievement, right? Anything that delivers this kind of fulfillment notions. These really tap into one part of our brains, right? A very awesome and dominant part of our brains. That's the part of our brains that's involved in structured goal pursuit, right? And striving. And our this is something we are wired to do, right? We are creatures, we are endowed with this capacity to pursue goals, to find insight into things, and to strive to really engage our minds. And uh, um and no doubt we can do this. But one thing that happens when we do that is that it often just tends to take over our lives, right? When we're really focused on finding purpose or meaning, then that's the kind of pursuit that just given how our minds are, like our mind will take that pursuit and it will just let it infiltrate all areas of our life so that we are really just focused on that one part of ourselves. And, this is backed up by so much in society that tells us to do this, right? And definitely so much in ancient philosophy. So there's such a rich tradition within philosophy, within the history of philosophy of focusing on this kind of rational aspect of our minds that we tend to think it's the most important and best part of ourselves. But it's really only just one part of our minds, and it's really only one aspect about us. And again, it takes up space, and it's so easy to let it take up all of our space. But I think that if we look at the big picture, if we separate ourselves from these societal pressures and biases to see these things as the most important aspects of ourselves, then we can recognize that yes, striving for things, using our mind in this way is really important and part of a good life, but also that it should be limited, and it should be limited because there's other parts of our minds that operate, and the part of our mind that is engaging in interesting experience and having those right is very much it's still cognitive, but it doesn't have the kind of structured rational thought that the search for meaning and purpose does. So we're capable of having this kind of unstructured cognitive experiences where we're not pursuing something and we're not trying to get anywhere or learn it. We're just having the experience, and that can really add value to our lives. And yet we really neglect that when we think so much about meaning. So it's similar the bottom line, these other aspects, and so too with interestingness, right? It's
Mm.
such an important part of our lives, but they all have a distinctive role that they play. The reason why they're part of our good lives, right, is because they contribute something different. And by focusing on any one of those things, right, we're really only kind of like getting at one aspect of who we are and the kinds of good lives that are possible for us.
So then let's talk about making life interesting. I'm fairly convinced that if we were to try to think of a good life, what would be definitely present there is perhaps many really valuable or engaging, interesting experiences. But why is it that adding interesting experiences to your life will also just bring you to a good life? Like, why does that, flip the switch and make a life that feels somewhat empty, more fulfilling or pleasurable or just good in however you're defining that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think the best scientific explanation of what it's doing for us, what interesting experiences are doing for us, is that they are really tapping into parts of our minds that are activated by novelty, by challenge, and by complexity, right? And if we think historically about what our minds are about, right?
Mm,
In the face of anything new, right? What does our mind do with it? It tries to figure it out, right? It tries to understand it, to wrap its head around it. And so we've got all these powers to really engage our minds and engage them for the sake of engagement or understanding or whatever it is, right? But it's engagement without necessarily the purpose of getting somewhere. And
mm,
so, but often now that life is so easy, it can get so easy, right? We don't tend, our minds, we don't tend to give our minds this experience of being challenged or confronted or forced to have these kind of new thoughts and wrap our head around new things. And yet our mind is really capable of this, right? And so one of the things that happens when we do allow ourselves to be challenged, when we do stimulate our mind to confront new things, to have new ideas, is that it really it generates this kind of, and I talk about in terms of it's unstructured cognitive engagement, but
right.
there's this kind of experience of having free flowing, stimulating thoughts, right? Along with the emotions that can accompany them.
Mm,
And so when our mind is engaging in new ideas and having new thoughts, right? If we allow them to seep into our emotions, if we let them really take over and connect with us, then we allow ourselves a richer range of emotional experiences that we'll have within these interesting moments. And one thing that we know about this is that uh, with interestingness, with psychological rich experiences, we often develop this kind of change of perspective. And
mm,
uh, a change of perspective is always going to enrich our lives, right? It allows us to see things from a different way and appreciate things, and whether they're things out there in the world or whether there are things going on within our own lives, right? It allows us to appreciate things from a new perspective, right? From a new framework. And so it's really going to lead to a more robust kind of life. And one that is really tapping into all that our mind is really capable of. Mhm.
I think in the pursuit of valuable experiences, you're often pushing yourself to go beyond what you're normally comfortable with, and you do it because it would maybe be an interesting thing to do. But the pitfall of that is you can often get stuck in situations that you really should not be stuck in, like a job that maybe you actually should just quit, or a relationship that you need to get out of. And in the book, you've cautioned against doing things just for the sake of experience itself. The thing that you're doing should be valuable, and it should also not make you feel unsafe. But the concern I'm still left with is that you could very easily tell yourself when you're in a bad situation that you're doing it because it's an interesting experience and we should embrace messiness and novelty as part of the good life. And oh, well, happiness isn't going to be there all the time anyway. So why not just push through? So, how do you ensure that this philosophy isn't going to be used to rationalize getting in or staying in a situation that could deeply hurt you?
Yeah, yeah, because when you're the kind of situation that you're describing there, where it so and we've all had them, right? Where things are really challenging for us, and we're there for whatever reason, right? Whether we took the new job, whatever, for whatever reason, we find ourselves somewhere where it's really challenging us, um, and we're not really getting anything out of it, but we think that maybe we will, and so we push through, and. Uh, One of the things that I think is pivotal to avoid that kind of pushing through mentality is to really be in touch with what we're getting out of an experience. So this is not, as you just mentioned, right? What I'm advocating for isn't just like chasing experiences, like
Right.
going for something just because it's an experience. Uh, but what we really want to do is think about what we're deriving, what we're getting through those experiences. And so in these moments where we find ourselves challenged, maybe really overly challenged or in difficult or perhaps unsafe situations, uh, we really need to take the moment to say, all right, well, what are we getting from that now? And
Mm.
there, one of the things about interestingness is that it's not a push through kind of thing. You don't just push through and then have an interesting experience, right? Uh, you can create them and stimulate them, but there's not really like a push. There's not like let me suffer to have this other, interesting experience. That's the wrong way to be thinking about this, right? Interesting experiments are here in the here and now, and
Mm.
they deliver in the here and now. And uh, I think that's really important to realize, particularly given what we said about like so many of the pursuing things, putting your eggs in the basket of something that might come. Um, that's not what interestingness is about. It's about enjoying, um, experiencing the moments and letting them infiltrate our minds and really allowing ourselves to engage with the moments. And sure, yes, this often can happen in difficult moments, but to avoid this mentality of saying, all right, well, I'm just going to like suffer in order to get someplace else, right? That's not what we're thinking about. If you're not getting anything out of this moment beyond suffering, then uh, I'd say get out of it, right?
Right.
But you certainly want to be aware, and I think that's the big message here, right? If we're going to have good lives, right, we need to know what they are, right? What we're kind of working with, but we also need to be able to be in touch with ourselves to be able to understand what's going on with us in a moment, and uh, that's I think really where interesting experiences will and kind of trying to harness the ability to create them and notice them is really going to pay off. But it does start with identifying with what's happening with yourselves in the moment and being aware, right? If your moment is just something that's just way too challenging, then it's not going to be an interesting one. And
Right.
so the push through mentality is really counterproductive, certainly for interestingness. Mhm.
And in the book, you actually do talk quite a bit about mindfulness and reframing. So, I guess on this topic, reframing your experiences more positively is definitely a very powerful tool because you can have an experience and then you can choose the story that you're going to tell yourself about it. And
Mhm.
you can maybe elect to tell yourself more positive stories, right? In fact, when you're educated about, say, how pursuing, just chasing happiness and meaning all the time isn't the best thing to do, and that sometimes it is just great to do something because it's an interesting and valuable and psychologically enriching experience, then you can choose to do things differently or continue doing what you're doing, but realizing that even if you're not feeling like fully happy with it in the moment, it might still be worth pursuing as long as it's not too far outside your comfort zone.
Yeah.
But how do you draw the line between a healthy reframe and a kind of an emotional bypassing where you're kind of using the thought of, well, at least this is interesting to avoid what's being with what's actually happening and just maybe admitting to yourself, like, wow, actually, this isn't a good situation and letting yourself fully feel that? Because it feels like you're giving your readers a lot of very, very good and powerful tools, but how do you know if you're using it right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I have something that may not be that satisfying to say, but you're using it right when you're having an interesting experience.
Mm,
And one of the things about reframing that you talk about, and yeah, it is one of these things, right, where it can be so beneficial, but then it also can, be so destructive in a way, also when it's used to um, really kind of change when it's when we're trying to reframe something into something that it's really not, and especially if we're motivated by some other reasons for doing that, that can lead us pretty far away and out of touch with what our experiences are. And yet at the same time, so much of our experience is shaped by the mental framework that we bring to it. And so when I think about the relationship between our mental framework and the experiences we're having, uh, I see it more as if we shape what it is that we bring to that experience, then we can create a different kind of experience for ourselves. And I don't know if that's so much reframing or framing
mm,
at the outset. But what will determine the kind of experiential quality that we're having, right? The quality of the experience in the moment. What's going to determine that is going to be the mindset that we bring to that. And so if we have, a negative mindset, as we all know, right? Nothing good is going to happen, right? If we bring negativity to our lives, we create negativity within our lives. And but if we can bring a sense of openness, and that may require reframing for a lot of us, right? To set aside the scripts and stories that we tell of ourselves and just bring openness to our experiences, then we're setting ourselves up to have to be able to we're bringing our minds in a way that will invite interesting experiences because we're open to them. But if we just went into that with a script like, oh, this is going to be too hard, this is going to be negative, or even like this is going to be awesome, right? We're
mm.
setting ourselves up for expectations, and expectations uh, are counterproductive in the context of interesting experiences, right? Interesting experiences arrive from the unexpected, and so the more that we can just kind of like reframe ourselves by dropping expectations, right? By setting aside scripts that we might always tell ourselves, and just bring openness, then that's a way to frame our experiences in a way that'll invite interestingness.
So now you tell us that interesting experiences don't come from expecting them. They kind of just happen to you.
Yeah.
Uh, the problem then is for the readers of your book and the listeners to this who now decide that they too want to have interesting experiences, now they would want to try to put themselves out there and see if anything would click for them. Is that
Yeah.
not the right way to approach it then?
Think that is, but we just got to be really careful about what we're describing here, right? So say say we're traveling, right? And travel, by the way, is such a great source of interestingness. And the latest research is showing that the most positive correlation with psychological richness are like short trips, right? So it's
Mm,
not even like getting on a plane, going somewhere. It's like driving to a town 10 minutes away and taking it in.
mm,
Uh, but think about what we do when we travel or we go somewhere new. So there's certainly many of us will go through, we'll read about what we're going to experience, we'll get the reviews, right? We'll form in our head a kind of exact expectation for what we think this will be like. And when we do that, it's when we form that expectation of what we think an experience will be like, right? Uh, we're really shaping ourselves in a way that's both going to preclude the kind of spontaneous, unexpected moments from getting in, right? But we're also just setting ourselves up like, okay, well, this is going to be good if this happens, and bad if it doesn't, right? And having
Mm.
really specific expectations about what experiences will be like, is just bound to really stand in tension with having an interesting experience. Yet that doesn't mean that we can't locate ourselves or position ourselves in places to have interesting experiences. And so we can do this not necessarily by having expectations that, if I redo this one thing, it will be an interesting experience. Sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't, right? I mean, I think we've all like signed up for a class that we expect will be interesting and then it's really not. And often or we could sign up for a class because we like the time period and then find out it's totally interesting, right? So expectations don't always, even if we're expecting to have an interesting experience, we might not. And so they just don't track. We want to loosen up on that relationship between that. Yet we can position ourselves to have more interesting experiences by learning about the conditions that are conducive towards them. And
Mm.
so even just by learning that uh, so what have I just thrown out there? Like, oh yeah, short trips are one of the best ways to have interesting experiences, yet expectations are the best way to kind of prevent those, right?
Mm.
Well, then we know that, all right, so maybe I just go on a short trip with no expectations, and
Right.
put yourself that way, right? Then you've got that open mind, right? The open mind is conducive to like letting everything come at you, let happen. Uh, so then you've positioned yourself into a place where like, yeah, you're probably going to have an interesting experience. You're in some place new, right? So it's
Mm.
going to challenge your mind. It's going to force your mind to engage. And you're bringing to it a sense of openness. So you have no judgments, no preconditions. You're not going to think, oh, great, this has happened or not, right? You're just going to have an experience and it'll probably be an interesting one if you brought that openness to it and if it's one that stimulates your mind.
Right. I want to step back from interesting and just talk about the good life in general. In your book, one thing that's absent is talking about doing good for the world. So why is it that in your conception of the good life, which is involving happiness, meaning, and interesting experiences, why is there not also a focus there on on doing good for other people, or at the very least, like living ethically, both for the sake of that being something that's inherently valuable, but also just for the sake of enriching your life further?
Yeah, yeah. Um, Excellent question. So the stimulation for this book was a collaborative project I did with a psychologist um, who actually had this hunch that we were missing this notion that we came to label psychological richness. But so the project started by trying to carve out the field, as it were, right? And to say, all right, so within philosophy and psychology, we've got kind of like two main approaches towards thinking about what's a good life, one's happiness, and the other we've kind of grouped together under this label of meaning. And uh, I would, and included where I'm getting with this is that including, I would put that under a life full of needing. I have defended eudaimonia. I really
Right.
believe that we really need to be good people in order to, and I put it at the level of like basic functioning, actually. So in my own mind, so I guess there's two things I want to say here, right? So the first is that, there's a sense in which, because we are trying to track like the psychological, where the camps into where the research has drawn, that we ended up putting folks like eudaimonistic views under the category of meaning, and finding purpose, which I certainly think is accurate. But the second level, when I think about this myself, and when I trapped my head around, how did eudaimonia, um, you know, how does our relationships and the way we interact with others and the contributions we make to that world, how does that fit into a good life?
Mhm.
I would say it's more of a precondition for the good life. I don't think we get anywhere in life unless we are really committed to pro-social behavior, to treating others with care and respect. This was the first philosophical book I wrote was all about thinking about how working with not with Aristotle's conception of eudaimonia, but within a psychological conception of eudaimonia, and how morality fits into that.
Mm.
And what I end up arguing is that, being a good person, right? Developing virtue is really going to be part, it's like essential to our basic functioning in the world. If we're not acting well towards others, we're not satisfying our needs to belong, right? We're interfering with a lot of our basic capabilities. And so my own more robust thoughts on how virtue and morality fits into the good life. I think it's a precondition, and it's only once we've kind of got those basics sorted out that we can then go on to think, okay, and like, what are the experiences that count as well?
Mm.
So that's how I tend to see that relationship.
Right. So living ethically is a precondition when we're talking about the meaning dimension of all of this. But I want to push on this a little bit more because it's one thing about living ethically, like just not treating others in a bad way, or like the people around you or your community or the world in general. But there's also the importance of doing good and prioritizing doing good in the world. It doesn't necessarily have to be at the level of, say, effective altruism, but if someone is living a life that is full of happiness whenever it comes, they find meaning in what they're doing, and they're finding a lot of interest. They have a lot of different, psychologically rich experiences. But what they're doing isn't having a substantial impact on the world, which is full of suffering, full of problems that need to be addressed. Is that a good life, or is that missing something important there?
Yeah, I think there is. I do think it's the question of where we find meaning, and if we're, you know, we would love to think that most of us are going out there and find meaning through our contributions to the world and to making these positive impacts. But I think I don't think that the I don't think there's enough reason to think that we can't live a good life without making that kind of contribution. And so, earlier I was talking about the importance, as you picked up on, like on our interpersonal relationships, and that's what I ultimately come down and think is most important to our most necessary to our basic functioning and flourishing. And yeah, I think it is possible that someone could live a good life. As long as, through having positive pro-social relationships without making these larger contributions to the world, because they can find meaning through other veins, right? Through other pathways. Um, does that mean I don't think it's important to make these positive contributions to the world? Not at all, right? I think that, the good life doesn't have to be the end all be all, right? It may be the case that what's most important overall working to fight climate change, working to eliminate poverty, right? And, but I think but it very well may be the case that we ought to be doing those things, but I do think that there's evidence that might somehow inhibit our lives from going really well. And I think that's just how it is. And so in the real world, though, I think that, given that I think we have moral obligations to help others that are independent of their impact on our lives, right, on our own experiences. So we have these moral obligations, and I think inde- you know, they're not just independent of our lives, but they're separately motivated, right? So it's not that we have these moral obligations because they're part of the good life. And that's where we get to this side of like, all right, so you can have a good life without necessarily having these larger world commitments. But on the flip side, I also think that for many of us, we find meaning through fulfilling our greater moral obligations. And
Right.
so, uh, and if that's the case, right, that we're finding meaning throughout this, then that's how these larger moral obligations can enter into our good lives. But that I don't think they're necessary to it because we can find meaning and fulfillment through other ways.
Going back to uh, bringing interesting into our lives. Could you
Yeah.
talk about how the art of the interesting applies to relationships?
Yeah, yeah. So I think this is so important. I guess it's one of my own pet peeves is that when we all we hear from the happiness research is that what do we hear? We know that relationships are essential to happiness, and
Right.
obviously totally true. But relationships are pretty essential to everything, I think, and they play a really important role in both the having and development of having interesting experiences. You know, I think, and I've been very influenced by David Hume on this, that Hume was the one of the early ones to really identify the extent to which our empathic connections with others influence our emotions. And so, what Hume argued was that, every emotion that we have, right, any feelings of pleasure and pain, they'll just languish apart from company. And what he's getting at there is how it is that uh, through he called it sympathetic, but we would call it empathy, right? But through communication with others, we can really share in our feelings and feel things more robustly by feeling them around and with other people, right? There's this kind of seconding job we do. I think we all know that, right? When we share feelings, when we pour our hearts out to a good friend and they're with us, right? We're having a much more robust experience of those emotions and it is through having this kind of robust experience of emotions that we can develop with one another that we can really be have uh have a lot of interesting experiences with and so relationships are they're pathways for many things but it's through relationships that we can really feel things more robustly and that's going to help stimulate or maybe not stimulate that's going to help bring interesting experiences to fruition, right? So if we kind of like take off and we can have interesting experiences on our own, absolutely, right? But when we're with somebody else, we can really kind of enliven and embolden those interesting experiences to make them really robust, to allow ourselves to feel with one another, to go back and forth with one another and keep that kind of engagement going, right? Together we can get to these deeper and more robust kinds of interesting experiences. And uh, on a simpler level, though, right, we can just have so many of our interesting experiences we have with other people, right? Think about conversations, right?
Yeah.
A conversation typically, outside of classrooms and work and things like that, like when we're having a conversation with someone, it's because it's interesting. Um, and if we're bored of the conversation, we try to get right out of it as soon as we can. But when we're enjoying, talking with somebody, very often it's just because we're having an interesting conversation. And as I've been trying to describe, interestingness arises, like our experience of interestingness really arises when we're deeply cognitively engaged with something and we allow that engagement to penetrate our emotions. And through the back and forth between people, that's such an easy way to have an interesting experience because you've got that extra, you're with somebody and you've got their extra, their perspective and your perspective, and you can just get that kind of ripples going more of cognitive engagement with other people.
And other than relationships, where else is focusing on the bringing interesting into your life really valuable? Maybe you could start off with talking about parties, because I thought that was a pretty fascinating part of the book.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Um, yeah. So often parties are really boring, right? And so, what do we do at parties, right? Parties tend to focus on eating and drinking, definitely like pleasurable things. But they're very one note, right? And again, we all need those moments. We all need it, right? But they're also very one note. And with a little bit of creativity, we can have more interesting parties, right? We can, bring back the board games, the card nights. In the book, I tell a story about. I love this. I had a friend who would have parties that are scavenger hunts, and they'd be themed, right? She's so creative, right? So there was this one party. It was like Game of Thrones. This is the story of the book. It's Game of Thrones. I've tried to watch the show. I've not really been successful in watching the show, but I don't know. She gave me a fur coat and said, "Yeah, it'll be fine." Right. So, um, and then you get into groups and you go out on an adventure, right? And you're trying to find something. You're working together with other people, just trying to like find a clue, right? Figure out where something is, right? Like, and think about what's going on in those moments. You're being challenged. You're activating your curiosity. You're working with one another. You're reaping all the benefits of social engagement. And and it's all just simply about giving you something else to do, right? And so by having more interesting parties, right, we can really provide more interesting experiences for everybody and make everything really more interesting. But it just takes some kind of creative idea for a group to do something beyond just sitting and chatting.
Yeah, in fact, a party that I had gone to recently, they had this game where when you come in, you take like a small chit that has someone's name written on it, someone else who's also at the party, and you have to, by the end of it, get them to say a specific word. It could be something random, and all you're given is the word and their name. And you also may not know who it is, so you have to go in to figure out who it is and get them to say it. And everyone knows that this game is going on, so they're going to try to be careful not to say a word that they think someone else is getting them to. And what I thought, and I remember thinking that that was a super fun and interesting game. And in the book, I think you had also talked about like a very similar one where it was about, I think heroes and villains. Is
And
that right?
villains, yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, this is a great one. So, again, these are all my friends' ideas. I'm actually really not, maybe I'm getting better, but you can steal ideas from your friends. It's fine. But so what they did though was, so it was actually, it was a casino party, but a sub theme was this heroes and villains party, was this hero and villains thing, which really captured the moment. And so, similarly, like you walk in and then you're assigned to be a hero or a villain. And the villains take out the heroes by getting a selfie with them. And so it is just like all about trying to trick somebody. So it became all about trying to trick somebody into like forgetting about this thing and then somehow getting a selfie with them and then kind of like taking out all of the heroes. And so it's similar kind of thing, right? Where everyone is like playing a role, you're not really sure uh what it is. And one nice thing about this one, and perhaps that was similar with yours, it was very diffuse throughout the entire night, right? I mean, there were other things, right? There was dancing, there was drinking, there were casino playing, right? Uh, and so one of the ways in which I think that works so well, that whole like take out somebody by taking a selfie with them, was because we'd be distracted. We'd be having fun doing all of these other things, right? And then, someone just come right in and be like, I got you. Um, so so yeah, so these things can really introduce like so much more interest into a social occasion, and they're really easy to throw in there. It just takes someone to think about it, and it takes open minds, right? Hopefully you're with a group of people who has the open mind enough to be like, yeah, I'm going to take the hero or villain card, right? I'm not just not going to play or do it. But to have the open mind to be like, yeah, sure, whatever, we'll see what happens. And interesting things happen when you take that approach. Mhm.
Are there any other areas where of your life where bringing in the interesting is valuable, which we haven't touched on already?
Yeah, so one thing I think is really advantageous about this aspect of the good life is that we can have interesting moments wherever we are and in whatever time frame we have. And so think about all the wasted space that we have during the day, right? We're commuting, we're sitting, waiting for somebody. These are just times in which we just tend to think, whatever. It just is these like that the minutes in lives that we have to get through to get to the good stuff, right? Or to the important stuff. But we can really. learn to take those moments, those otherwise wasted time, and to create interesting experiences for ourselves. And we can do that by really just taking um, extra steps, right? Like to be curious about something around us, right? When you're curious about things, you're really just trying to like notice something and then just ask why. And that again, when approached with a kind of openness, right? Little things like that will allow you to have interesting experiences during these otherwise times where we're just stuck. And I think a lot about commutes. I remember when I first started studying happiness in 2013. I remember so clearly when all this was happening. Um, but I was really distressed by this. There's this statistic that long commutes are really one of the big detractors of happiness, right? There's actually only like really like a handful of findings about what really can inhibit happiness, and long commutes are one of them. And yet so many of us are stuck with long commutes, right? For financial reasons, for whatever it is. They can just happen. And commutes, I think, are just a perfect opportunity to give yourself the space to have interesting moments. And I'm sure we've all got our own things that we're dialed into, like we're doing a podcast, we're doing something on these commutes. But if we just took the moment to maybe just turn off everything, right, and look around, look outside, there's a lot that you can notice. There's a lot that you can pick up on, even if it's the same darn commute. You can, by just opening your eyes and just noticing something, whether it's, the group of people waiting at the bus stop has shifted, right? Or it's raining that day and everyone's got umbrellas, and look at that person who doesn't have the umbrella. What are they thinking about? We can really kind of engage with ourselves by ourselves, even while, doing the same commute. And in that moment, I think that's the best skill we can really develop, because it doesn't require that we change anything about our lives or like all of a sudden take on this big project of having a good life and doing these things. We can just make it better right now, right in these moments. And that's a really important skill that I think we can all develop.
And could you talk to us then about vicariously getting the interesting in your life?
Yeah, yeah. This is another thing so advantageous about this aspect of the good life, and because one thing the research we know from very early on is that vicarious experiences are just as good, right? As in terms of creating psychological rich states as are the real thing, right? And we know this, right? We know that you can watch documentary about traveling somewhere and get so much out of it, right? And these are vicarious experiences, but by placing yourself within them, you can have this kind of internal dialogue with yourself, this internal engagement, without ever really even having to leave your room, right? And I think some of our earliest experiences probably are for my generation are reading books, right? When you're reading a book, you reading a book is an interesting experience, right? We don't really read books absent school or jobs or things like that unless they're interesting. And one of the ways in which that you know lots of ways that we can find interesting ways are just by reading about another culture, reading about someone's experiences, reading about another person's life, reading about a fairyland, whatever it is. We can just have these interesting experiences by reading about them, and about the places, about people who are having interesting experiences. And again, as long as we have that openness and that willingness to let it take over and engage, then we can have vicarious, interesting experiences. And uh, that's huge, right? I think too often we think that the good life is something we can only get when we're lucky, when we have wealth enough to have free time, to have all of these things. And I don't think that's true. I think we can really develop good lives, re- re- I mean, obviously, we need our basic needs satisfied, right? But if we're not struggling to pay the bills, then we can live a good life, all right? We can really have these opportunities for moments without without needing to fly across the world, without needing to have vacation time. All of these things are great and awful, and great and helpful. But to think that they're the only ways in which we can in which we can have a good life, I think that's misleading. And it really is, not a productive way to think. A better way to think is, all right, what can I do right now in this moment to enhance it and to make this moment better? And we'll live better lives when we do that more.
So by now, my understanding is that we want to do both things. We want to set ourselves up to potentially have interesting experiences by, say, traveling, but we also want to focus on in the moment, just seeing what we can notice, seeing if there's anything that can be, cognitively like very stimulating and engaging to us. Is that a correct understanding of what you think we should do?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that, yeah, there are things we can have, and there's certainly like directions in our lives that we can push through to set ourselves up to have more interesting experiences. But we can do the same things internally within ourselves. And it gets back to this idea of stimulating our minds, right? So when we travel, when we go somewhere new, right, we're forcing our minds to engage, right? If we've never seen something, we're trying to wrap our heads around, our mind is forced to engage. And uh, but we don't have to, we can stimulate our minds to engage, right? We don't have to wait for something out there to force our minds to engage, right? We can stimulate our minds to engage. We can notice something new around you. I've been, wherever you are, you can look around and notice something new. You can bring curiosity to something, and really try to, like, that might start with a little bit of forcing it, like, all right, well, why this and why this? But if, again, you have that openness, right, you allow it to happen, right, you allow your minds to be stimulated. um, we can do those things. And so it's all about, interesting experiences are all about these robust cognitive engagements. And
Mm.
by learning when our minds have them, right, we can both position ourselves so that they'll come really easily, but we can also learn, to bring them about within ourselves. And I think both are really important to do.
And finally, I wanted to talk about the Leo Tolstoy fable that you wrote about in the conclusion because I thought it was wonderful. To summarize it, there's a traveler that is running away from a beast. So he jumps into a well and then he realizes that there's a dragon at the bottom of the well. So he grabs onto a branch that's growing out of a crack somewhere. And as he's hanging on, he notices that there's two mice, one black and one white, that are actually gnawing away at the branch, and he notices that there are some drops of honey that are on the leaves of the branch. So, with the moments he has left, he decides to lick them. And as you talk about, he goes after this simple pleasure while he awaits his death. But that goodness, in those moments of getting the drops of honey, that goodness is not going to last very long. So, the question that you have the reader think about is, what are you going to do when the honey dries up? Could you tell us the answer to the question that you wrote about?
Oh, you're going to have an interesting, you're going to be thinking about things. You're going to be thinking about the nature of the situation. You're going to be noticing the mice and their interactions and why they're there. You're going to be looking around, and wondering why this tree is sticking out of a crevice in the rocks. Uh, but and the message is to not just sit back and allow yourself to just be, the fable is told as a story of, like, shoot, how it's about death, right? And how we shouldn't really fear so much of it. And that was Tolstoy's point, I think, was to say, all right, let's recognize it's going to happen, yet still appreciate things in the moment. And but this is all, I think it is such an important, it's an important fable, right? But there's more to it, right? If we know how to really live truly good lives, then we're going to take that moment and we're going to make it interesting, uh, and that moment will be interesting, even if it's our last one, right? It'll be interesting, and what more could we want?
This has been a wonderful episode. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you, Yash. Great to chat with you.